Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's CECAN webinar. My name is Amy Proctor. I'm a lecturer at the Centre for Rural Economy at Newcastle University and one of CECAN's researchers. Today I'm going to be helping to chair the webinar along with my CECAN colleague at Newcastle University, Francis Rowe. For those of you who haven't joined us before, CECAN stands for Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. For the past 3 years, we've been transforming the practice of policy evaluation across the food, energy, water and environmental domain to make it fit for a complex world. We've achieved this through pioneering, testing and promoting innovative policy evaluation approaches with UK government departments and agencies. To find out more about our work, please visit our website, which is cecan.ac.uk. Today's webinar will look at a systems approach to environmental policy in Defra, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Tom Oliver, who is Professor of Applied Ecology at the University of Reading. Tom's primary research focuses on understanding the interacting impacts of drivers upon multiple environmental outcomes. Tom leads the Ecology and Evolution Research Division at Reading and sits on the European Environment Agency Scientific Committee. Tom's published more than 80 scientific papers in world-leading interdisciplinary journals, and his writings also appeared in The Guardian and The Independent. Today, Tom is going to talk about his role as Senior Fellow with Defra, working to coordinate their systems research programme, something I know many in CECAN are keen to hear more about. So Tom's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions. If you could submit your questions for Tom via the question and answer box, which you should be able to see on the Zoom webinar control panel, which popped up when you joined the webinar. We'll be sort of monitoring those questions and making sure we can answer as many at the end of the presentation. And just to let you know, this webinar will be recorded and will be shortly available on the CECAN website. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Tom.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thanks to CECAN for inviting me today. So, today I'm going to give a bit of a summary of the Defra Systems Research Programme. So, as Amy mentioned, I'm based at the University of Reading, Professor of Applied Ecology there, but I've also been involved in this Defra programme, which has been running since March 2019. So today I'm just going to give quite a broad overview of the programme, and then we'll take, I guess, a deep dive into a couple of case studies, and I'll give you lots of personal reflections on my own on the process. So my email addresses are here if you want to email with any questions or feedback afterwards, and they'll be at the end as well. So let's jump in. I guess just to give a bit of background on Defra, obviously Defra is a very large organisation, over 26,000 full-time staff. If you just look at core Defra, that's in central government, there's about 3,750 staff. But obviously they work closely with the arm's length bodies. So you've got the Forestry Commission, the Environment Agency, Natural England, for example. So there's a real challenge, I guess, just coordinating such a kind of mammoth organisation and working across with other government departments as well. But in addition to that, you know, let's not beat about the bush. There's a significant environment associated challenges that we face today. So, for example, air pollution causes, you know, around 30,000 deaths every year. 10% of children have a diagnosable mental health problem, yet only 1 in 4 of those actually receive some kind of treatment. Now, Defra at the moment are piloting a green social prescribing scheme. So that's getting people out in the environment, community groups, conservation volunteers, because the evidence really shows that engagement with the natural environment, with green space and blue space, can improve both physical and mental health. But obviously there's a lot to go from a pilot scheme to mainstreaming these, you know, some of these solutions. In associated aspects, you know, 2/3 of us in the UK are overweight or obese, and obviously that itself is a complex systems problem. But at least part of the reason for that is the lack of access to engaging with the natural environment, and also our food systems. You know, the ability to access healthy, you know, affordable food. Both of those obviously in Defra's remit. Biodiversity is also in Defra's remit, and about of the Convention for Biological Diversity, so international targets, these were set in 2010, but they weren't achieved, so they were pushed back or renewed targets by 2020. But actually in the UK, we've only achieved, if you listen to RSPB assessment, we've achieved about 3 of our 20 targets. The government think it's slightly more, about a third, but whichever estimate you take, that's far below where we need to be in terms of addressing biodiversity decline. The State of Nature was a big report, and it ranked countries by their biodiversity intactness, and the UK came 29th to the bottom. And that's associated with land use degradation, which also leads to things like soil erosion. We're losing 2.2 million tons of topsoil every year. That's a particular problem in areas like East Anglia for food security. And 84% of our river water bodies are not in good ecological status. So these are just a few headlines. It's quite easy to find headline trends like this. There are many other things I could talk about: noise pollution and climate change progress. So some really challenging situation. But in addition to that, we exist in a rapidly changing world. On the left here, we've got the European Environment Agency, what they call global megatrends. So this is documenting some big global drivers like population trends, urbanization, changing risk of pandemics, geopolitical issues. On the right, you've got the MOD assessment of similar sort of large-scale trends and trying to assess the risk of impacts of those trends. Another way of framing this is what's been called the Great Acceleration by Will Stephan and colleagues. So on the left here, you've got long-term trends in socioeconomic factors like population size, fertilizer consumption, water use. And on the right, you've got Earth system trends. So, carbon dioxide or ocean acidification or tropical forest loss. The pattern is the same. You could see it's this hockey stick shaped trend where we get exponential growth really over the last 50 years. And we know that on a finite planet, that increasing resource use, increasing pollution is only going to come back and bite us and drive systemic risks to our economy, our health, our well-being. So there have been growing calls as a consequence for systems transformation. So shown here are some science policy organizations talking about food system transformation, but there's an equal clamor of calls for transforming our energy systems, our mobility systems, our health systems. When we talk about a system, what do we mean here? So if we think about the food system, what I'm talking about is the whole value chain from the production of food or the harvesting of fish right to the end of the chain of the consumption. But all the way along that chain, there's a whole range of actors, manufacturers, transporters, retailers, finance, agribusinesses, as well as individuals, not just as role as consumers, but shareholders, individual farmers and fishers, and then of course the governance of that system. So if you think about this complex web, millions, if not billions of individuals linked through economic interactions as well as social interactions. And we somehow need to transform the way this web works. And if you look at the little cartoon on the bottom right, you've got this idea that the system is in some undesirable state or trajectory. It's in this cup, this domain of attraction, and we want to somehow tip it over into this desirable state or desirable trajectory. But we need to overcome that hump. And how can we lower that to try to shift the system? What are the factors that we can do to transform the system? So the European Environment Agency have done a lot of work on this. This SOER 2020 is their State of the European Environment report. So that's a 5-year report they produce. It's a kind of overview of environmental trends, but in subsequent iterations of the report, they focus much more on a kind of solutions-oriented approach to, how do we actually not just articulate the environmental decline in ever more nuanced ways? How do we actually develop solutions? And actually, the EA have been really, I guess, at the forefront of developing this synthesis on sustainability transitions. Just as a bit of an aside, it's a real pity that the UK obviously has ejected itself from that club. You can see here the blank part on the map as of February 2020. And I sit on the scientific committee, and well, I did. October was our last meeting, and now it's a real pity that we don't have access to some of these kind of knowledge insights. But anyway, gripes aside, this output from the EA was focusing on innovations for food system transformation. And you can see here there are things about technical innovations, but also social innovations. But in addition to just developing new ways of kind of doing things, there's also a kind of a need to overcome the existing system. So, we can develop alternative food networks, but if people can simply buy cheaper food that's less sustainable, it can undercut those networks and make them, not feasible. So how do we overcome the kind of lock-ins of the existing system? I was lucky enough to be involved in this workshop where we pulled together people from a range of different disciplines. We had people from development studies, institutional economics, geography, ecology, business studies. And initially, when we got people together, a few people said, oh, it's about the economy, stupid. It's about subsidies. We pay farmers to farm in the way they do. We incentivize the destruction of the environment, and that's why biodiversity is declining, as well as the food system driving a third of global climate carbon emissions and water impacts, etc. But actually, when we got really stuck into the workshop, there was a recognition there was a whole range of factors. So, knowledge constraints. A retailer, for example, might want to sell more sustainable products, but you look at the ingredients, it's very difficult to understand the embedded water or carbon footprint or the biodiversity impacts of a certain product. Economic constraints. Obviously, perverse subsidies is a major one, but there are others. Number 10 here. If an actor has invested a certain amount of capital sunken into an intensive food production approach, it's very difficult to suddenly change tack. So actually, Defra are very good at these economic constraints, and also, I guess, working with the academic community on knowledge, but perhaps less focused on the socio-cultural factors, although there are an increasing number of social scientists in Defra now. Just an example, if you look at number 17, belief in techno-fixes, this is the idea that we try and say, well, pollinators are declining, we need to address this problem, and people say, well, we can just invent robotic pollinators, don't worry about it, or we can geo-engineer our way out of the climate. Now, of course, there's a role for technological solutions, but it's not the only solution needed, of course. Number 16, if moving up, abdication of responsibility. People think the government will look after the long-term needs of society. That's the social contract. But governments often have believed in the free market and the kind of invisible hand of the free market, which should optimize the system for the benefit of society overall, which we find is patently not true. So there's a real issue there about responsibility. And of limited collective identity is another one. We look after ourselves as individuals and we look after our close family, but we have less care for people on the other side of the world, or other species or other habitats on the other side of the world. I've actually written a book about this area. I guess that's a story for another day, perhaps, how changing mindsets can lead to changes in pro-environmental behavior. So we'll leave that for now. All good bookshops, though, of course. And the last factor is biophysical constraints. And again, this is one that's, I guess, partly more neglected. And this is the idea that we may want to transform the system, we may get the economic levers right, but actually we've degraded the environment in such a way that we've destroyed many of the natural enemies, the ladybirds, the spiders that would eat the pests on our crops. So we're locked in now to using chemical pesticides, or we've damaged the soil and we're now locked into still using intensive chemical fertilizers. So overcoming these constraints, and not just the economic levers, but all of these constraints, is important to transform the system if we want to transform this whole web and move it to this alternative state. Now, obviously, this slide is very detailed. I'm not going to go into it, but the whole point really to get from this is that these mechanisms, as you can see on the right, the colors are codes for knowledge, economic or socio-cultural factors. The solutions can be instigated by individuals, business or government, and they can address lock-in mechanisms pertaining to those different levels. And the key factor is, the polycentric governance of this system, and how government, obviously not just developing policies in a top-down way, but can facilitate overcoming those lock-ins at the levels of businesses or individuals as well. So I guess this is, a systems approach, really. I could have shown you this abstract kind of figure at the start, but I wanted to really paint a picture of the complexity of these systems, how we need to draw on different disciplinary perspectives, from psychology to economics to the physical sciences. And if we're thinking about policy intervention, thinking about the plurality of perspectives and values of the system, thinking about multiple outcomes. We don't just want to develop a policy to address one outcome, but it leads to burden shifting and negatively impacting another objective. We need to think at multiple spatial scales. So, we need to think about local concerns and aspirations, but also reconcile that with, how much carbon we need to sequester at national level, or how to create coherent ecological networks at the national level. And we need to think about multiple timescales. Let's think many generations ahead. So Defra obviously face a lot of systems problems. In fact, most of their problems, they deal with time lags, interdependencies, plurality of perspectives, views, and interests. And there's a real need for this systems approach to a lot of the problems they face. So that was the reason that the previous chief scientific advisor in Defra, Professor Ian Boyd here, set up the systems research program, and it's been well supported by the current chief scientific advisor, Gideon Henderson, and the permanent secretary. We started in a kind of staggered way in March 2019, and the way the program was set up was that there were these 5 what you might call outcome systems: so air quality, food, marine, rural land use, and resources and waste. And the reason I think that Ian Boyd set it up like this is that this reflects some of the outcome systems in Defra. And what it enabled us is that so each of these systems, I should say, had an academic fellow associated with it, and also one member of Defra full-time staff. And this enabled them to kind of jump straight in and engage with those policy and evidence teams, and really help them take a systems approach to some of the problems that they face. But in reflection, I guess a kind of cost from that is that our team initially reflected the siloed structure of Defra, and the ability to deal with some of these cross-cutting issues, let's say, for example, net zero, was slightly hampered. So really, my role was partly the design, synthesis, coordination, along with a counterpart in Defra, Dan McGonigal. And certainly in the second year, we've taken a much more cross-cutting approach to the way we tackle some of the problems. So overall, the aims, I guess, accounting for complex interactions, so avoiding unanticipated consequences of policies. We need a step change in how we manage the environment, and that entails risks. Making big, bold policy choices entails the risk of them going very badly wrong. So how do you de-risk those decisions so ministers have the confidence that, to put it frankly, they're not going to lose their job when everything, goes wrong? So there's a real role to develop that confidence in the decision making. Building systems thinking capacity within Defra, and also filling evidence gaps. So this is working closely with the UK research councils. For example, we've been helping with the strategic priority funds ideas development in Defra, also helping develop the areas of research interest. So this is what government publishes in terms of the key research gaps that they have to help them address their current problems. So here are some of the work areas. As I said, I'm not going to deal with each of these in detail. There are aspects of rural land use, for example, nature-based solutions, very relevant with the current COP26 discussions. Marine, actually for marine, there was a lot more basic science that still needs doing. How much carbon is stored in the marine system, in the seagrass beds that can be impacted by deep sea trawling, for example. Air quality and food, I'll talk a little bit more about. And then we have a resources and waste strand as well. For example, thinking about securing critical material resource flows. And then there are these cross-cutting issues. So for example, net zero, or how to deal with multiple outcomes that we want from our land. So I guess the approach that we take is you could call systems plus, or we haven't quite got the terminology yet, but the idea really is that if you think about systems approaches, there's a very broad church. There's systems engineering approaches, there's biological systems approaches, there's social sciences methods as well. And we really wanted to draw on the full range of those methodologies. But also on the right here, we recognize there's a crucial role for for more transdisciplinary approaches. So this is engaging stakeholders as part of the framing of problems and the decision making, because we know that this, what's called a post-normal approach, is essential, really. It's not just about a very quantitative approach to optimizing a system. There's too much deep uncertainty, there's too much contradictory values and perspectives on the system. So it needs a much more bottom-up approach to framing problems before integrating those quantitative methods as well. So one of the things we did was to look at some of the range of different methodologies that are out there. Obviously, there are many ways you could categorize these, and here we just did it by these two axes, qualitative or quantitative, and also whether you do this in a very participatory way with multiple stakeholders, or it's much more kind of sat on a computer running, or with a wet cold towel wrapped around your head on a desk. We started to explore the different ways that methods might be combined to address a certain policy problem. But actually, our program had to fit into existing work in government as well. And for example, GoScience, the Government Office for Science, had produced a futures toolkit already. So this is thinking about future scenarios, anticipatory thinking. And they were interested with the Cabinet Office in developing a systems toolkit. So we helped them with that, with some of our thinking and ideas. But we didn't want to, replicate what they were planning to do there. There was also some existing work within Defra. So actually, this is something that the food, farming, and biosecurity team did with CECAN to map this obviously very complex policy system. So we wanted to build from these existing initiatives, and just going back to the toolkit idea, rather than review 20, 30 different methods, what we thought would be best is actually think about Defra's problems, work back from the decision-making coalface. What are the really key 4 or 5 systems methods that we need? How can we let's trial those, develop case studies, reflect on how they work best within the context of Defra. So that was really our approach, and I find it useful to think about these 3 phases of sustainability transition. So this is trying to transform those big systems towards sustainability. And these 3 phases of, one is envisioning, where do you want the system to be? The European Commission have their framework strapline is living well within the limits of the planet. So what is living well? Is it having cheap food? Is it having slightly more expensive food, but that it's healthy and sustainable? How do we make that balance? So this is about involving people in dialogue, developing those visions of the future, both at the local level, but also at the national level. And as I mentioned, reconciling those visions across scales. In terms of implementing, designing policy in a way which we need to have some anticipatory knowledge, trying to understand where the policy could go wrong. And this is obviously difficult. We talked about the global megatrends. It's a very dynamic system. How do you de-risk those the policy design? And then in terms of evaluation, taking a learning attitude, we know there's going to be unanticipated effects. How do we have an adaptive policy framework? And also, how do we evaluate and measure our transitions towards sustainability? So if we have that vision, those shared visions, I guess, then how do we track how well we're doing towards that and navigate a course appropriately? So I guess I'm just going to give some examples of each of those from the Defra Systems Research Programme, in collaboration, of course, with the different policy teams. This first example is about envisioning futures, and this is about the food system. So the government are developing a national food strategy, and Bob Doherty, the academic fellow in the food subsystem, and Yard, who was his Defra counterpart, worked to develop this kind of conceptual framing of the food system, and they use that to develop stakeholder consultations, public dialogue. So they held citizen assemblies where citizens were asked to discuss how they think the future food system should look like. And there's also a dashboard of metrics being developed. So this, I guess, links to the evaluation phase of how do we measure the transformation towards a food system which can deliver healthy, nutritious, accessible, affordable food. And I guess at the bottom here, we've been working closely with the Royal Society as well. They've got what's called a Living Landscapes programme, and that has a series of public dialogues as well, trying to understand how people feel about their landscapes and how they might like to envision them being transformed. A second aspect of envisioning here is something I've been more closely involved in, is environmental targets. So Defra need to set targets for 2043 with milestones, and they'll be held to account to this by the forthcoming Office for Environmental Protection. And this is a really tricky game because on the one hand, the targets have to be sufficiently ambitious that they're not heavily criticised by a whole range of stakeholders and by the Office for Environmental Protection. But they also need to be feasible, both in the context of those changing drivers. So this acronym here, STEEPV, means social, technological, economic, environmental, political, and values. So trying to think about these changing contexts that will affect the success of achieving those targets. And of course, the targets need to be, the policies to achieve them need to be feasible, viable, I guess, in terms of the economics of doing that. So the approach we're taking, I guess, is still in design, but it's trying to balance these poles of feasibility, which is I guess the scientific feasibility of delivering a target, a certain level of air quality or biodiversity restoration, in the context of those changing drivers. Now, a lot of the teams had quantitative models. So the air quality team, for example, have really good models for how pollutants, flow through the atmosphere and can affect people's health. But actually, when you're thinking, 20 or so years ahead, you really need to think about those other drivers, changing demographics, changing geopolitical situation, economic threats. So, there are no quantitative models that do that. So although the existing models have a role to play in helping thinking about feasibility, it needs a much broader analysis. There's no point having a very precise quantitative analysis of part of the system, but ignoring what we know are very key important drivers. So that really speaks to a much more qualitative, I guess, expert elicitation approach there. Viability is the economic analysis. Can the government afford it? Is the policy deliverable in the context of other departmental actions across government? And the desirability, this is the social sciences element, I guess, is how acceptable is a certain level of a target to key stakeholders. And so this is not, there's a lot of deep uncertainty here. This is not about optimizing to identify a certain level of an environmental target. This is about avoiding the red flags, as it were, and sitting somewhere in the middle in this kind of satisfying, just good enough space. And then those were the targets that will be taken forward for further exploration, analysis of trade-offs and further economic analysis. So moving on, just to give you some examples of implementing. So this is the design of policy to kind of create those step changes towards sustainability. In this case, you've got the air quality team have been working to develop this participatory systems map. So this is right in the middle. You probably can't read this. Oops, especially if I do that. Right in the middle, we have particulate matter sources. And, these are, this is trying to map the different factors that affect the amount of particulate matter in the atmosphere. So it's things like how fast people drive their cars, whether they have air conditioning, domestic heating. You can map existing policies on here to try to mitigate some of these impacts. But also it helps you identify policy blind spots, potential feedback loops or just areas where there's not current policy development to make sure that you're fully addressing all the factors that are likely to affect that atmospheric pollution. Similarly, the air quality team have also been active thinking about trade-offs with policies for climate change. So the CCC, this is the Committee for Climate Change. They're an independent body. Obviously, they're developing policy scenarios to try to reach net zero. And actually, the air quality team wanted to know what those scenarios might do for air quality. And in some cases, it's positive for certain pollutants, and in other cases, it's negative. We've taken that approach a bit further, and I've been involved in this looking at not just air quality, but a whole range of different environmental outcomes. And this is where we've used this expert elicitation approach using what's called a Delphi analysis to try, if I just show the image, it probably explains it best. On the vertical here, you've got 12 different policy scenarios to try to head towards net zero. So the first one, for example, large-scale planting of short rotation forests. And on the horizontal, you've got on the top, you've got these outcomes, environmental outcomes. And so each of these colors, red meaning a severe trade-off, green meaning positive, these relate to the average scores across experts. And underlying those, we can obviously look at the uncertainty, but also we can collate the rationales and understand the context dependency around those impacts. But you can see here just an initial outcome is that, this broad swathe of red in the middle, where these policies related to biofuels and biogas potentially having major negative impacts on soil health or thriving plants and wildlife or recreation. What you can do is this document will be hyperlinked, so you can click on any of the boxes and you get a scorecard, and this gives you the overall score across the experts and the confidence, but also, as I mentioned, the rationales by which the experts produce their scores, and also we'll be developing further evidence sources. So really, the aim of this is initially is just to start those help to target dialogues between policy teams. So obviously the climate mitigation team needs to be speaking to the biodiversity team and the flood protection team, etc. And it helps to target those discussions for the policy design. But beyond that, I mentioned there's context dependencies in these impacts. So, the configuration of forestry affects its impacts on flood protection and water availability and water quality, etc. So there are a number of models which can be used to help with that. So a lot of these models are held, by academic organizations or NGOs. There are quantitative models for how changing landscape structure will affect recreation, how it will affect pollination, flood protection, carbon sequestration, air quality. And these can all inform, decisions about how we use our land. So, you have this process from data, integrating environmental data, modeling, validation, and then using these in decision support. I mean, just some really basics elements of validation, though, are often missed, and I think this is, important to flag up. With regards to integrated spatial modeling, there's a need to bring all these different analysis of outcomes into one framework. Ultimately, we need to inform decision making. So, for example, biodiversity offsetting. This is where we're talking about building and development. It's going to impact biodiversity or flood protection. We need to understand what the impacts would be so that we can create equal benefits elsewhere, or if not more. This is the principle of net gain. And Natural England, for example, have developed a framework here where on the rows essentially are land use types. And the columns are benefits that you get from those. So, for example, pollination and flood protection and carbon. I mean, this is essentially just a lookup table saying this land cover type provides this level of flood protection. But we know there's important context dependency. It depends where that land parcel is. Is that forest at the top of a catchment, or is it right at the bottom of the catchment, etc. Now, to be fair, Natural England have tried to incorporate some of that context dependency into this lookup table, but actually we know it's far more complex than just a yes/no. There are process models out there. For example, this image is a process model of pollination. So you can feed in data about land cover, data about nesting floor resources, and predicts how many bees there will be in a certain place. And this is a postdoc Emma Gardner's recent work validating this against 250 sites across the country where people have been out and monitored bees over several years. And this process model does a reasonable job at predicting pollinators. But if you take the same validation data set and look at this ecometrics, what it's called, this lookup table approach, actually it cannot predict in any way pollination. Now, that's, to be fair, it may be better for other things like carbon sequestration, but it just shows the constraints in trying to create a very simple tool that it risks the danger of being simplistic, I guess. And of course, we need to be pragmatic and assess all these outcomes in the same place, but also we need to be rigorous in terms of the figures actually need to mean something. So there's this challenge, you know, at the other end of the scale, you've got all these models, but they're so disparate and they're spread amongst the academic community and NGOs. And, you know, you can fund a grant to develop these models, and an academic may say, yeah, I'll take the money, give me 5 years and I'll develop a model. But actually we need these models in the next 1, 2 or 3 years to inform net zero policy decisions, to inform how the new environmental land management scheme will look. So it gets slightly more complicated. In addition to having to bring together academia and government for that integrated spatial modelling, there's a real important need to include a range of stakeholders as well, other stakeholders. That's businesses, NGOs, but also civil society. Because in those models, there are normative assumptions. So for example, if you've got an economic model, there's a discount rate. That's saying how much you value having something now versus having it in the future. And actually, that's a normative decision. You don't want that to be decided by, you know, a single economist in an office. You know, it needs public dialogue. It needs debate. You know, what aspects of biodiversity are important? Is it the ones that is it species that we see when we go outside our door into the local environment, or is it about protecting rare species in isolated nature reserves? What's the balance of funds towards those two elements of biodiversity? So those normative assumptions need surfacing and debating. The second point is about democratic legitimacy. So this is about, you know, there's a danger that sustainability policies may be imposed top down. We're not talking about tweaking the margins here. We're talking about major changes in the way we live, in the way we travel, in the way we work. And if you impose those top down, so for example, the fuel tax rises in France leading to the yellow vest protests, you know, arguably that was a progressive motivation behind the reducing the use of fossil fuels, but actually the way it was implemented led to this, you know, major civil unrest. So you really need to bring people along, bring citizens along, and co-create those decisions. The third aspect is about public attitudes, just really understanding, you know, what are the local concerns and aspirations, and understanding what is politically possible. And I guess the final points are around engaging a whole range of different stakeholders to work with government. Because these systems are governed in a polycentric way, you need those actors to also be pulling with you. And so even at the individual level, you know, people being involved in these bigger decision-making processes also lends them personal agency. And evidence shows leads to pro-environmental behavior changes in other aspects of their lives. So actually, just before I move on there, I just want to highlight that there is this real major funding gap, I think, here, because although the government, the UK government through the Research Councils funds, you know, science in the UK reasonably well, a lot of that goes towards the majority of it goes towards primary science. Government has very little funds to commission research. So in the middle, there's this huge implementation funding gap for implementation research. And that's what this blog is about, if you're interested to follow up more. But just to give you an example, you've got local councils, you know, over 250 local councils in the UK have declared a climate emergency. They have to make decisions now about, you know, whether to ban cars from their town centres to improve air quality and reduce emissions, or whether to plant a forest over here for flood protection, or plant it over here for carbon sequestration and also recreational values. You know, most of these councils, you know, 60% of them have had to lose their local ecologist because they couldn't afford it, let alone having someone who can inform on air quality or the economics of health. You know, and maybe nor should these councils be actually having to crunch the data all themselves and run the models. You know, that could be centralized. So you need this much better interaction between evidence and provision at the decision-making coalface for these local councils, and also engaging civil society in that decision-making process. So that's what this relational diagram at the top's about. And it really needs a major funding injection towards that implementation research, in my opinion. So I guess coming towards the end now, I've talked about these phases of you know, transforming systems, envisioning, implementing. I haven't talked much about evaluating, and I won't talk about that much today. CECAN have actually been very active working with Defra. CECAN led a report about handling complexity in policy evaluation. I mean, just to pull out a couple of insights, I guess, about evaluation is that, you know, I've talked about we can't really optimize these systems. It's more about, satisficing. We know that there's deep uncertainty. There's going to be unanticipated outcomes. So we really need an adaptive approach to policy design. We don't want to get locked in. Let's say the Common Agricultural Policy. It was obvious after a while that it was damaging biodiversity. Yet we were locked into that. And we have an opportunity, a really good opportunity, to redesign a land management scheme, which can be better, but it may have unanticipated effects, and we don't want to be locked into that alternative scheme. So we need to have an adaptive, more agile approach to policy as well. And really, just to end, I guess, thinking about the future, this is a new project that's starting in January next year, working with CECAN and Defra and a couple of universities. And in terms of evaluating, this is about thinking about systemic risks that will affect recovery from COVID. That recovery has been framed quite strongly in terms of rebuilding the economy, maintaining social cohesion and health, rightly so. But also the environment is important in underpinning those aspects, and that's been relatively neglected. So this project was aiming to try to highlight some of those dependencies upon the environment, whether it's with regards to preventing a second zoonotic emergence, which is patently possible, improving the links between air quality and respiratory health and COVID mortality, and also food security. So this project is about trying to analyze those systemic risks, understand what are the data, where are the watch points that we need to kind of monitor the system, and if not develop proactive mitigation policy, at least be able to sort of understand how the system is changing, so we can put in place timely measures to prevent those risks being materialized. So that will start as a 12-month project that will start in January. And I guess, just to wrap up, in terms of next steps, well, the Defra Systems Research Programme Fellows, their contracts end in March 2021. There's lots of work going, really. I mean, the Environmental Targets Programme will run until at least September, the Systemic Risk Project I mentioned. There's also, we've just become involved a lot more in thinking about organisational design within Defra. And I think this is a really interesting topic. I mean, taking a systems approach to inform that organisational design. I mean, I've already talked about some of the different disciplines that need to be involved in a systems approach, but there's also insights from a topic called organizational wisdom or institutional wisdom. If I just read out some insights from a paper by Jennifer Rowley, this was back in 2006, thinking about the systems diagram below, but this is from a different field of research called institutional wisdom. So it is about organizational wisdom is about making sophisticated and sensitive use of knowledge. It's about using judgment that accommodates multiple realities and weighs the interest of multiple stakeholders. It's about taking into account wider social and ethical considerations, and it's about taking a long-term perspective. I think that very much sounds like what I've described in terms of systems thinking and systems literacy. So actually, in addition to many of the disciplines that I talked about, behavioral psychology, economics, biophysical sciences, hydrological modeling, ecology, there's also great benefits in drawing on some of that literature about organizational wisdom from information management and knowledge management theory. So it's a really exciting place to be as an academic, the kind of nexus of all these different disciplines, in addition to these being critical problems. And we also need to take a transdisciplinary approach involving citizens and stakeholders in a much more kind of post-normal way. So that's a really exciting place to work. And yeah, I hope we can continue, and Defra can continue to develop that across working, across government as well, especially on challenges like net zero. And I guess just the last thing to mention, some of these ideas that I've talked about and some other aspects of the program and the case studies are in this Defra Systems Research Primer that we will, I think CECAN have kindly agreed that we can circulate amongst participants, circulate a link for that amongst the participants. So that's really great that they can do that. And so, yeah, that just leads me to say thank you, really. Thanks for taking time to come and listen to the talk this lunchtime. Thanks to many collaborators, institutions as well. And thank you to CECAN for inviting me. And yeah, contact details are there if we don't have time to cover any questions, or if you just want any comments or queries or feedback. And yeah, thanks again for listening.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, Tom, for a fantastic presentation. Obviously covering quite a lot there, and no small feat in your fellowship role there in terms of what you're thinking about and covering. So lots of questions, I think, already rolling in. So just to remind anybody, if you do have any questions for Tom, please pop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. Fran, do you want to
Yes, we've got 4 or 5 questions covering a range of what Tom's been talking about. The first one is about how governments target and measure success. Can governments better measure and manage their goals to assess system health? E.g., land managers and conservationists are equally involved in assessing feedback loops. So that's a suggestion. How can governments better target and measure success and get away from the kind of linear input-output outcome way of thinking?
Yeah, I think there's definitely need to develop those indicators of a successful transition. You know, are we on the way to where we want to be? As I mentioned, those cycles of envisioning, implementing, evaluating, they're all kind of linked in a way. And even on the evaluation side, you know, we need to know where we want to be. And I think there are these high level targets like the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the 25-year environment plan. But what does that mean at a local, regional level? I think that envisioning work, you know, there's still a real job to do that. And then we can maybe develop those indicators for, are we successfully getting there? And I think a key element is also that individual departments are not pulling in different directions, and the policy teams need to make sure that, you know, their policies are not shifting burdens. So it's when designing a policy and thinking about the outcomes, I think there's a critical need to also be ticking off how it will affect the objectives of other policy teams and equally other government departments. What will it do for health? What will it do for aspects of transport, aspects of community well-being, etc.
I'd like to follow that with there's a linked question here really about how is the system-based approach changing the culture of thinking and working within Defra? Is there an institutional and cultural shift taking place which is more systems-based and complexity sensitive from your experience?
I'd like to say so. I mean, yeah, I mean, that's the aim of our program, I guess. Obviously, that would be hugely ambitious to achieve in 2 years, because achieving kind of cultural changes and institutional changes takes longer. But I think, you know, our program, I guess, is part of that broader shift towards a greater recognition of the importance of joined up thinking. And I think that it's clear that's happening across government because of, for example, the net zero challenge, the recognition that there's a massive need to improve coordination across government. I think it was less important in an area of, you know, more relative status quo, or in a, you know, but actually when you think about these big sustainability transitions to achieve, for example, zero emissions by 2050, or to reverse biodiversity decline, when you think about the scale of these challenges, you realize that any kind of bold policy move to achieve them is going to have massive effects on other areas of the system. So I think there's a growing recognition that that's important. And I think, yeah, the culture is slowly changing, but it's about also getting the incentives right, I guess, in terms of how teams work together on a day-to-day basis. You know, if there's a whole range of aspects about how, you know, people are recognized in their roles and etc. that kind of needs to maybe change and be tweaked to better facilitate that kind of and catalyze that systems approach.
Okay. The questions are coming in thick and fast, which is brilliant. So the next question is, how do you integrate a risk-based approach to inform policy and research and development priorities inside systems thinking?
So, yeah, I think, yeah, that's a good question. I think it's, in a way, thinking about the multiple outcomes of policies is this kind of risk-based approach where we're trying to de-risk these policies, and we want to present, I suppose, information to ministers to say, okay, this is a range of policies that we can look at, but these are the risks in terms of possible multiple outcomes. Here's how some of the risks might be mitigated, how some of the trade-offs, the negative trade-offs, can be kind of ameliorated. And here's how we can really, it's not just about risk as well, I guess, of opportunities. Here's some potential synergies in the way that the design of this policy could be tweaked to really also get benefits for health, to get benefits for the economy as well. And so, yeah, I think that approach of thinking about multiple outcomes of any decision lends itself to that analysis of risk and opportunity. I think there's a bigger discussion about risk as well, which is more about some of these systemic risks that we face from the drivers. And my personal opinion is that that's done, it could be done a lot better at the moment. I think there's a real danger from some of these drivers of climate change and nitrogen deposition and loss of soil, that the short-term focus of policy, not just the UK government but around the world, is not dealing with these long-term problems sufficiently. So opening up that analysis of risk, of systemic risk, and as a society how we deal with it and how we transform our governance, I think is an urgent debate we need to have.
Okay, there's a question here about social prescribing, which I think you mentioned. Given social prescribing has been ongoing in the NHS for over a decade, why are Defra doing it? So
this, I can't see the question, sorry, but this is about green social prescribing. Mm-hmm. And what's been announced at the moment is a pilot scheme where there'll be 4 pilots funded. They're called test and learn pilots, I think. And this is about kind of exploring the implementation of these green social prescribing schemes, and really tracking, I guess, also the mental health and physical health benefits that can be got from those schemes. So it's actions like, getting people out, conservation volunteering, or community allotment schemes, or I don't know, forest bathing even. I mean, the things they'll be measuring will be very much the kind of biophysical health benefits, I think, and also the economics. For me, I think the benefits of people engaging in nature, also the deeper elements of changing people's mindsets. And when people are much more connected to nature, lots of evidence from environmental psychology shows that they also have more pro-environmental behaviors. So they recycle more, they reduce their carbon footprint. So rather than, as I mentioned, these being kind of niche pilot schemes, I really think there's a need to kind of mainstream these approaches to kind of better encourage people and to engage with nature. And that might mean rewilding many of our towns and cities, because actually the access to nature is quite poor, and that then leads to lack of appreciation and lack of engagement with nature. Okay.
There's a couple of questions that you might want to think about together. One about, can you say more about validation and how you see this can be done in the context of complex policy? And then another question about a set of suggested interventions related to the kind of problems people are addressing. So maybe think about those.
I'm not quite sure the last one. Was there any more context to that? Or
I'll just have a look.
I'll deal with the first one. About validation, I guess, if this is about the validation of the different models that are used to inform the policy, then I think there's a big role to bring together, to harmonize some of the data in the UK or internationally, if this is done internationally. So at the moment, it's very disparate. So you've got one research group, for example, Reading, we work a lot on the pollination modeling. Then you've got Exeter working on modeling recreational values. Then you've got another group looking at flood protection, and that's the Environment Agency also do that. So these validation data sets sometimes are just held in academic servers. They're funded by taxpayers' money. There's no reason why they shouldn't be in a centralized database to be able to validate models. And then there's a need, when any model is produced, it shouldn't be a black box. It shouldn't be an organization saying, oh, I've got a model that can predict this. If you give me some consultancy fees, I'll run the model for you. The model needs to be open access. It needs to be transparent. The code needs to be lodged somewhere that allows it to be challenged with these validation data sets. And if in 5 years a new model comes along that's better for a certain region, then that model can be used. So this kind of integrated platform for spatial modeling is something that I've been certainly pushing strongly for. It's not a single model, and but it's about a platform where there's these validation data sets can be lodged, the models can be lodged. So the decision support system is there and can be used in anger at the moment, but also it's a dynamic kind of living data set and community of practice to kind of further refine those models to predict ecosystem functioning and services. I think that's the only way it can work, and it makes sense to do it centralized rather than, as I mentioned, each combined authority or each council having to go and try to scavenge data sets and develop their own models.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess that sort of thinking and that way of using models then leads to suggested interventions which are context related and context dependent.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's the role of bringing in the local communities as well. So it's that kind of interaction between the sort of the science around the modeling, the kind of policy decision process, but also the citizens and the other stakeholders. And at the moment, there's not many. There are a few nice examples where those are brought together, but it's still few and far between. But we're not, we need to be mainstreaming this, in my opinion, under the the threat of climate change and the massive need to transform our agricultural systems. And yet the money's not there, the incentives are not there to be able to do that.
Okay, thanks. There's a sort of comment here, but it perhaps leads to some of the work that you've been doing. How do people cope with all this? It's really interesting for academics and researchers, but people can't take on board everything that might be connected in thinking about the complex world and how you intervene in a policy sense. Any ideas?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've struggled myself with this all the time. If you think about transdisciplinary science, I guess, first you've got specialists, and we need specialists. This is not about everyone becoming a generalist by any means. You need people who really understand the nuts and bolts of a certain process. They need to be linked up with people who work across disciplines, and then you need those transdisciplinary scientists or facilitators, as it were, who can also engage with stakeholders and bring people together, bring those different elements together to really create a coherent decision support framework. And so I think there's several roles there for different types of people, and there's obviously no one person knows everything and knows all those specialisms. But that's how we run society. No one person knows how to probably to build this pen. The design of it is lodged in many different institutions and protocols and people's mindsets and understandings. And I guess it's how we bring together the knowledge in the right way and the kind of infrastructure. So this speaks to those sort of organizational design questions. And how many people do you need to think in a very systems way? I mean, ideally, you want everyone to be thinking of those bigger pictures, but there's a certain set of people who really need to have that helicopter view, and they need to be able to work closely with a specialist as well. And I think the kind of right element of numbers of those different types of people is something that's needs more research. I should actually say there are other departments, for example, the MOD have done a lot of work on kind of assessing systems thinking capability, and they've developed kind of psychological questionnaires where you can sort of score capacity for systems type thinking. They have different levels, and they show that they've got a training scheme that can move people from level 1 to level 2. So then that leads to the question, well, how many people do you want at level 2 or level 3, and how much are you going to invest in that training? And I think those are really interesting questions that I don't know the answer to, and we probably don't have time to resolve in a couple of minutes.
Okay. There's a
we've probably got no, Fran, it's okay. Just time for probably one last question.
Oh, okay, because there's so many that have come in.
I know.
It's generated a huge amount of interest from sort of questioning the mindset that goes with cost-benefit analysis through to a kind of an overarching question about the systems research programme. It's clearly had an impact, and you've been able to take this helicopter view at the same time as going into a lot of conceptual and practical detail about embedding systems thinking and complexity, appropriate ways of making and policy making and adaptive policy making. So I guess the final question is, even if the fellows will move on next March, will the systems research programme continue? And if not, why not?
So yeah, great questions, and I'm looking forward to kind of looking at these in more detail. And please do follow up if if there are things to address that are not covered. I think with regards to the program, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a recognised need for this type of approach. So whether the same fellows will remain in place, or whether definitely, I think the systems program within Defra will continue in some form. And also there's, as I mentioned, kind of greater moves within government for example, linked work between Defra and BEIS around net zero is one example. So there's definitely going to be continuation of these themes. And hopefully, I would like to stay involved if possible. And yeah, I mean, just you mentioned something about the cost benefit mindset, I suppose, and I think that's an interesting one. And I do think there's definitely and perhaps I shouldn't get into this with 1 minute left, but there's definitely a kind of status quo of kind of very sort of economic command and control type analytical mindset I've found in government and academia, I guess. And I think there's a lot to learn from these post-normal science approaches, which take a much more kind of consideration of the deep uncertainty in the system and put greater relevance and focus on the social science elements, the ethics, the behavioral psychology, etc., to understand, what is the vision we're heading towards? Because you can have the best models and the best calculators, but unless you know where you're going, you're probably going to not end up where you want to be. So I think, as a country, we probably neglect that too much. That I think we need to open up those debates in society around how do we deal with climate change, how do we transform our agricultural systems, etc. Otherwise, we're going to create changes that not everyone's happy with, I guess. But yeah, I'll end there. Just thank you. Excellent questions, and I'll look forward to looking in more detail.
Great, thanks ever so much, Tom, for a fantastic presentation and for all the questions that came in. If your question didn't get answered, please get in touch with Tom directly if there's something that you want to follow up with him. I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. But just to say again that the webinar was recorded, so it will go up onto the CECAN website for anybody who maybe wasn't able to catch it. Do pass on the link. And yeah, thanks ever so much for everybody who joined us. And thanks, Tom.
Thank you. And thanks, Amy and Francis, for sharing as well.
No worries. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.